I wrote notes. Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
I'm
I'm like,
sorry, I'm gonna go, Chris.
I was just gonna say, I'm here with like two beautiful women. I'm excited. So,
Thank you.
hello, everyone.
And Chris, you look great. I was just talking about how great Chris looks. Look at us
I love that combo. Pre-warning to everyone that I have been fighting a cold. I feel much better, but my voice is still, if you're like, what happened to Liz? What is wrong with her today? And we're doing company photos, so that's why I am done up, which y'all don't usually see, but not the real me, but here I am anyway. So good to see everyone. I am so excited about today. I just pulled my phone out because I took notes on things I want to make sure we cover, Jenna, because I'm sure people tell you this all the time, but we are obsessed with your content.
Well, thanks.
And here at the clinic at OCD Texas, we use it with every patient, and we have integrated so much of your content into what we call our standard BP when patients first come here, like the motivation worksheets and the things like that you, and I love, we were just talking this morning about how some of those things, your examples are so specific and behavioral. When you gave that example about getting up in the morning, making breakfast for your son, picking whatever podcast you want. And anyway, we just love your content. So I'm so excited because I feel like I have so many questions. And what I'm most excited about today, you guys, is that Jenna not only will talk about her own experience and expertise and background, but you have so many deliverable tools that what we talk about, that people listening can access it, which is just so fun versus them feeling okay, well, how do I implement that in my own life? So we're so excited to have you. For those of you who don't know, Jenna is an incredible advocate, and just voice for individuals with OCD, clinician, et cetera. We can keep going. But Jenna, I would love for you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you got into OCD work, and why you do what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so gracious. I live in a world still where for the longest time, it was just my grandma following me on Instagram. And so I'm as long as my grandma loves it, I'm doing good. And I think as I've grown, I've had to forget that there are so many people watching. So I still live in a world where I feel it's just my grandma. And so to hear you say that you actually use my stuff and you love it, it's very strange to me, but I love it. And that's just a dream. So thank you so much. But, yeah, so my name is Jenna. I am in Wisconsin, but I wasn't always. And I actually grew up in Pennsylvania. I was a very, very anxious kid. I remember my earliest memories were going to a new school and oh my gosh, who am I going to sit next to? Had a stomach ache every day. But I even from a very early age, I knew that if I kept giving into that, it got worse. And if I didn't go to school this day, it would just be worse the next day. And I really loved the feeling of getting through something difficult. I loved that feeling of oh my gosh, I can't believe I just did that. That was so amazing. And so without even knowing anything about anxiety, knowing anything about OCD or exposures or anything like that, I was okay, I'm going to pick the scariest person to sit with. And I don't even have a question to ask, but I'm going to raise my hand because I don't want to. And so then in my Psych 101 class, which is very serendipitous, right? We don't learn about that stuff in Psych 101. But I learned about OCD and I learned about ERP. And I was this is everything. This is everything that I need to do. And so every research paper, every internship, everything was about OCD and anxiety from then on out. And I just really fell in love with it. And like I said, I think I was always an anxious kid. In hindsight, I've always done things. My earliest memories too were of doing things in threes because I felt if I didn't do things in threes, I would kill one of the Hanson brothers. I don't know if you guys know who Hanson is, but they're.
I'm telling you, Oomba. I
feel
sisters.
We need to play it. I was just that's a good hit from the. Yeah.
I have sisters, so I definitely know Hanson.
Yeah, and they're still one of my faves, but I felt I can't do this 2 times because then I'm going to kill Zach, and oh my gosh, I can't live with that. And so, but it all came to a head in 2018. I have a now 5.5-year-old. I had a son in 2018, and it just got so bad. It got so much worse. My first intrusive thought was him, and I had the thought that, oh my gosh, what if I snapped his ankles? And mind you, at that point, I had already been in the field for 10 years and I knew what it was. I knew that that was an intrusive thought. And I knew that I should have expected that of my mom. But still in those moments, I was like, oh, the stakes are way too high. I don't care if that was an intrusive thought. I don't care if I shouldn't let my husband put on the socks. I don't care. There's nothing in the world that will get me to put socks on him. And then, of course, it just got so much worse. It then became his pants and his shirt and can't give him a bath and like a million other things. And it morphed and went to get treatment myself. And it was a really incredible experience. So now I feel like, you know, just giving that back to other people. I love hearing from people like, oh my gosh, I had to pull over because I heard this on a podcast and I thought that I was going crazy. I thought that I was the only one. Like, I just want to give people that experience because I never had that experience of not knowing what it was. Like, I always knew that it was OCD. I always knew that it was an intrusive thought. I never thought that I was going crazy. I can't imagine how hard this would be not knowing what it is. And so that was always my mission, is to help those people because it's just got to be absolutely terrifying.
If I could highlight something that you said in your story, because I think it is, if we could bottle it and I could give it to other people struggling, I think it's one of those things, is when you were talking about when you were younger, like you knew if you avoided it, it got it worse. So you found yourself challenging yourself to put yourself in those situations. And that's the string that I seem to see when I talk to other advocates that have gotten better. I talk to clients that have really gotten better. It's that ability to say, look, like the way I'm living right now is not working for me anymore. In fact, the more that I'm doing this, everything I care about seems to get further and further. I have to show up to my life. I have to put myself in places that are like important to me. And I got to kind of push through it. And what I remind people is like any other space in our life outside of OCD work, if we want to get, if we want to start dating or if we want to get a raise at our job, you've got to put yourself in those hard situations. So how, I think you have such, like Liz was saying, you have such good content out there and things that people can get their hands on. How do you explain to a client that's afraid? They just found out they have OCD. They've given in for like 10 years. How do you explain that muscle that you talked about from a young age of just like, I got to put myself in situations to get my life back or I'm going to make it worse?
I think so much of it comes down to, as clinicians, we kind of have to be a little bit of a salesman, maybe isn't the right word, but we have to get them to see the facts of like, you started out with great intentions. Like, I wish that also helped you the first time that you did it. I wish that the first time I put avoided putting my socks on my son, that the next time I went to go and do that, it wasn't a problem for me anymore, but that's not what happened. Right. And so I always try to take them on this journey of like, let's actually look at how negatively this has impacted your life. Let's look at how this has gotten significantly worse over time. And they can see it, right? They can see it. And I find myself having a very similar conversation with a lot of my clients about, it's actually a concept from John Grayson. I think, Liz, this was a conversation that I saw you and him having at IUCDF one year about, the fantasy, about like relinquishing the fantasy that like we all, whether it's OCD or not, we kind of all have this fantasy, right? Like that we would love to know with 100% certainty that we're not going to, hit someone with our car ever. We all want with 100% certainty that we're with the right person and that person is our person and we're never going to be with the wrong person. We all want that fantasy, but that just doesn't exist. And so what can we do instead but have like our second best life, as John Grayson talks about? And so really getting them to understand like that they've been chasing this fantasy in some way and that it's not going to work out for them. In so many words, obviously this isn't like our first session together, but like how do we get them to live that second best life, which is still amazing because it's actually attainable and it's available to us. So trying to like highlight the ways in which they've attempted to have this fantasy, but that it hasn't worked. And then, okay, we can still live a really great life, even if we don't have that and achieve that unattainable bar that OCD sets us to.
Yeah, no, really well said. And I thought like when you were saying like second best life, I know for me in my own treatment and then what I see in clients is that life that they're trying to gain with like absolute like, I don't want anything bad to ever happen to me. What it really has people do then is get smaller. You know, I can't control the outside world, so I'll control my home. Can't control my home, I'll control my room. And I tell clients, I'm like, you're so striving for like this perfectionistic lifestyle that the OCD is kind of laid out for you. But what it's really done is you're not really dating. You don't have a lot of friends in your life. You've dropped your work, you've dropped your school, you're living at home, you're getting up in 2 in the afternoon. So I'm like, this life isn't working. Like, what if we kind of shifted and did something different? So I really liked that explanation. So thank you.
Yeah. And getting them to see too, like that the way that you want to live, like to be with your kids and to get a good night's sleep and to be able to be on time for work, like all those goals, you can have them, but it's not going to be done at the same time while you continue to also control every little thing. Like the OCD life that your OCD wants you to live and the life that your authentic self wants you to live, like they're completely discrepant. You cannot have both at the same time. So that's always a good conversation too.
Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I love that so much. And I remember having a patient here that like once we always have patients, like for mostly all of our patients, actually, they kind of like get going in treatment, right? I don't know if y'all experience this. And then they have this aha moment, right? Of like that when they really realize like, I can't live both lives. Like I have to get, and I've actually had patients even tell me, you know, Liz, right now I can kind of live both lives. Like I'm not in a relationship right now or whatever. So like I can give into more OCD and I can still have the life I want. And I was like, okay, well, it's a lot harder for you to have that willingness to do ERP until you get to a place or you start to create a life that doesn't allow you to have both lives, right? Where you have to say, I can't have the life I want and hold on to OCD.
Mm-hmm.
And now we all know, like, you can't have, even if you're not where you want to be or whatever, like you can't have a life fully with OCD. We know that. But for some people, there's this like, yeah, like right now I can kind of hold on to both, but there will come a point in my life, or if this happens, I know I would have to kind of make that choice. And this segues into like the first topic I really wanted to talk about today was motivation, because I think you have so many great like tools and tangible worksheets on this. And for us to really talk about like, how do we help people get there? So the folks that are in that camp where they're like, yes, I hear you, but like, I don't feel it yet, right? So like maybe I haven't made my life big enough and my OCD has been so big that like, I'm really struggling with the willingness or motivation to do the hard work that would require giving up OCD because my life isn't louder than OCD yet. Like, what do you do? Where do you start?
So one of the best strategies that I use all the time with my clients and also will help other therapists use is trying to, instead of thinking that ERP or challenging yourself or whatever, I think a lot of times people think that that has to be like the worst case scenario and like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to give up all these really big safety behaviors and do all these really scary things. Yes, maybe eventually, and maybe that's something that we can't avoid completely, but it's also like in the enjoyable activities too. I love exposures, or like call them behavioral experiments, whatever you want to call them, that are like kind of like behavioral activation in disguise. The best example that I could give of this, when I was working in residential, I worked with somebody who needed everything to be all organic laundry detergent, all organic clothes, all organic everything. And this person, like, you know, working in residential, I was like, okay, we need to get her to be able to do laundry. We need to get her to be able to brush her teeth. We need to be able to get her to cook food for herself. This person was not as motivated to do any of that. That's just not where they were in their stage of change and in their journey. But they did bring an item of clothing from a very popular store that was, of course, not all organic. And they were really motivated to wear that because it was this really pretty item of clothing. And as much as I was like, oh my gosh, laundry, oh my gosh, we need to get her to eat, I was like, okay, let's just do an exposure with this piece of clothing. And that worked so well because they were motivated to do that. They were kind of like charmed by this. I really want to be able to wear this thing, right? And so, yes, you're going to have to be able to do like the laundry and do the hard exposures to get to be able to do the daily activity living type things. But I also challenge people to think about the enjoyable things that you want to be able to do that OCD is holding you back from, whether that's soccer or hanging out with your kids, right? Like, ERP or behavioral experiments or whatever you want to call it, like it doesn't have to be this like hardcore thing It can just be like, okay, I want to go and hang out with my family. What's a small way that I could break an OCD rule today to help me be with my family again? So really incorporating those enjoyable activities a little bit more, I think is super, super helpful. I also think as people with OCD, we tend to feel or want to change everything all at once, which is like a recipe for disaster, just very all or nothing in black and white. I'm a big fan of small, consistent changes, like Atomic Habits all the way. That's a great book, but small, consistent changes can really add up for that long-term recovery. So I'm a big fan of that stuff too.
I love this so much because we talk about this all the time. Chris talks about like, yeah, like when I'm doing exposures, you see me in the community and I'm out and about and we're doing stuff. But I think that, Jenna, this is exactly the problem with ERP right now, is that the rap that ERP is getting is that it's this like torture that's not purposeful, right? And that we're just going to make you like think about your worst case scenarios and lean into uncertainty around things that like you don't need to lean into uncertainty around. And I'm like, where did that come from? Like why do we think that? And I always talk about how one of the things that bothers me the most is when clinicians will say, hey, I've got a patient with these fears. What exposure should I do? And I'm like, well, how would I know?
I don't know.
Like, you shouldn't know either. Like, your patient's the only one that'll know, because just like you said, we have to figure out, what are you most motivated to do first?
Right.
Because that's when the cards start unraveling, right? Is like when you get those couple experiences that you were really motivated to do because that shirt is something you really wanted to wear. Now you're going to be way more willing to try a laundry exposure next and do these other things when it feels so good and you get the freedom from it. But if you push that patient to do that laundry exposure where they're like, I don't really see the need for this right now. Like this isn't that important to me. Like I'm fine with, only doing, it's like, we're not lining up. So can you talk a little bit about that as like, how as a clinician, how do you make sure that like you're on target with your patient, and how can we start to recognize when we're not hitting the mark? But also for patients, what are some of the feelings you should be having in therapy and during ERP?
So I love this conversation so much. I need to come back because we're going to have so many things to talk about.
Yes, I know.
The one talk
and
that I
can come back anytime. We want you. So
I missed your talk about how ERP needs like a rebrand.
We can do it right now. Let's redo it.
It's funny. We're doing that next week with Hirschfield. So Hirschfield will be on.
Oh my gosh. Yes. But I missed it. I was giving a talk and I was like, I want to bounce my talk and come to your talk. But, I mean, like to me, I was doing ERP as a kid. Like when I was raising my hand, like that was ERP to me. I think of ERP as existing much more on a spectrum. I know when we hear about ERP, we hear about hierarchies. Like we think about hierarchies and sud scales and 0 to 10 and, do this exposure and write this down. Like maybe, and I've done it at residential for 10 years. Sometimes people need that really rigid and manualized approach. And that's amazing for some people. I think also ERP on the other end of the spectrum boils down to pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, reducing safety behaviors, and reducing avoidance. That's what I want people to do. I don't see how somebody can get better if they're not doing that stuff. So to your point, Liz, like as a clinician, sometimes my clients need that more manualized approach and they want that. And sometimes they just benefit more from the more looser structure. And, let's talk about values and let's talk about your goals and let's identify some ways you can push yourself outside of your comfort zone without reducing as much. And so I think of it much more as on a spectrum. And as long as I am helping them push themselves outside of their comfort zone, reducing compulsions and reducing avoidance, I don't really care how we get there but that's where we need people to go. And then as far as the feelings that they should be experiencing, I don't think there's any right or wrong way to feel, right? Like you're probably going to feel a whole range of everything. What I hope people can start to feel, in addition to, of course, the anxiety, of course, the fear, of course, the hesitancy and the ambivalence and whatever, I hope they start to feel excited. I hear so much about how like, oh my gosh, resisting rituals is so hard and it's so hard to not ruminate and it's so hard to not ask my husband for reassurance. Like, absolutely. Like some of the hardest things in my life that I've ever had to do was to drive on the highway and not pull over to check and make sure that I had my son in my car seat because I had these doubts that I would leave him somewhere. And it felt like I was the most irresponsible mom in the world to like, oh my gosh, I could have left my son somewhere. How do I keep driving? So yes, that's hard. It's also hard to continue living with OCD and like getting my freedom back, like that's exciting. Like that's the exciting piece. It's scary and it's exciting and it's freeing and it's empowering. It's not just hard. It is hard, but it's not just hard. So I hope people, and I like, that's my intention with some of my content is like, yes, it's scary and it's so, it has the potential to be very exciting. Like you have the potential to get your life back, and not just your life back, but like better than you ever thought before. You have the potential to have a freedom that you never ever had before. And in a way, like get a life better than it was even before you had OCD.
Yeah, and for the clinicians on there, one of the things we've been talking a lot about, and Chris, you can take over here, is when we think about rebranding ERP, it's exactly that. It's ERP should get you your life back. It should get you freedom, and it actually should be kind of fun. Like most of my patients, ERP is not this. Yes, it's hard at the beginning. Of course it's hard. And of course, like finding the willingness to do this hard work, but it is, you get it. Number one, like you should never be doing ERP that doesn't make sense to you. Like if you're doing ERP and you're like, why am I doing this? Or I'm doing this because my clinician said, but it doesn't make sense, or it goes against your values. Like that is not ERP, right? That's not effective treatment. But really, like ERP gets you more clarity. It gives you more confidence. It gets you to be able to live the life you want to live and be the person you want to be without anxiety or OCD dictating that. And I think we've just been talking about a rebrand because there's been so much negative talk about ERP being this like torturous thing that you write these detailed, disgusting scripts and like and it's like, why does it have to be that? Like, and actually a lot of the rebrands started with the incredible work of clinicians like Lauren Wadsworth and Caitlin Pinciotti and others who did the rebrand on social justice-based ERP. And I feel like that was really when we started to say, a lot of us were like, yeah, of course. And let's think about that as a whole, right? Like ERP shouldn't just be this like, oh, you have contamination OCD. Okay, like we're going to do this. It's like, no, like, what do you want to be doing? What do you wish you could?
Well, where I used to work, and this was like 10 years ago, I remember somebody felt very strongly about, we should have a directory of like contamination OCD exposures and harm OCD exposures and sexual intrusive thought exposures. And like they were really pushing for it. And I know that there are resources out there like that, but that should not be our one and only go-to. Like if anything, it could be like a source of inspiration and like, oh my gosh, it's going to be perfect. I never would have thought about that, only after you've done the functional analysis and all of the individualized work. I come from a world where I was taught that of the 28 people that we served in this facility, you should be able to have de-identified all of those hierarchies, all those treatment plans. And if 28 people in that house had contamination OCD, you should be able to pick a hierarchy from any of those individuals and know exactly who it was from. Because, two people can have contamination OCD, two people can have relationship OCD. And based on their core fears, their unique triggers, their unique difficulties, they could have wildly different trajectories. The example I always give is relationship OCD, right? Somebody could have a fear of being a bad partner, right? I'm afraid of being a bad partner. I have a crush on my gym instructor, and I feel like I have to come home and I have to confess everything. I looked at this person. If I don't confess this, I'm a horrible person. Somebody else with relationship OCD is going to have that retroactive jealousy and needing and having these urges to check everything and review potential scenarios. They both have relationship OCD, but those like superficial kind of what are some good exposures for relationship OCD lists or books or directories, it's not going to be very helpful because one exposure for one of those people is not going to do anything for the other because it has nothing to do with the same core fears. So in one situation, one person might have a core fear of being a bad person and being immoral and, just being bad. And that other person is maybe going to have a core fear of being duped or like feeling stupid or being wronged. And so we need to actually attack those core fears and put them into exposures like, okay, what are some other situations where you feel like you could be duped? What are some other situations where this other person feels like, that maybe you're a bad person. And then suddenly, like when we come up with that, it's like, oh my gosh, I act in so many ways outside of my relationship like that. And my fear of being duped or my fear of being a bad person affects my life outside of my relationship in so many ways. And then it's like, that's the magic. Like, let's attack all of those things. This doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your relationship. It's actually about your fear of being a bad person or your fear of being duped, you know?
Yeah, I was thinking about it while you and Liz were talking about, the rebrand. And it's like I understand why, and I think what I was actually thinking what would be awesome is to get like a panel of like younger clinicians and we can talk about the experience. Because I know when I first entered the field, it was very old school. It was very manualized. It was like by session 3, you should be doing exposures, and there was like this manualized thing. And I understand why there's a lot of clinicians out there and there's a lot of people out there that are grasping for other modalities because they're like, ERP sucks. Like the second day I went to my treatment, I was being thrown things at me, or I was having to call people and say things I would never say. And what I love about, I'm such, at least for me personally, I'm such a student of other people and kind of listening to what everybody else is saying and how the field moves. And I think one of the things that we're all talking about is like, when I have a client, I like to get clients out. So like you were talking about a client, Jenna, with that close, and it really, I feel like I treat the very similar way. I have a client that had a lot of animal feared illnesses. She had contamination, but it was all about like animals giving her a disease. And I'm lucky that in an IOP, I have 3 solid hours to work with a client. So we went to the Santa Ana Zoo. We went to this one prehistoric pets where they have like turtles and stuff. We went to the shelter and played with dogs and stuff. And her mom was saying like on the weekend, she wanted to come back to therapy and she was crying because she couldn't come. And I'm like, I can't always promise therapy is going to, but it's like, I'm not torturing my clients because most of the time I'm out in public with them. So if I really was torturing them, I'd be arrested. I had another client who had contamination, so she loves C's chocolate. So I was like, we can go to C's chocolate and we'll eat with our hands. And she was willing to do that. I think the other thing is I've also noticed that people have to understand why they're doing it. And so when you give them exposures that they don't align with, they feel like you're really just experimenting on them, or it's fear factor, you're kind of shocking them into submission. And I think that's why a lot of people have pushed for a more like cognitive component of ERP. And I think for me going into the field, it wasn't until I connected with Barbara Van Oppen, who uses a lot more CBT. And I remember thinking the whole time, like, she's giving reassurance. We're not supposed to do cognitive stuff. And then I'm like, wait a second. She's been around way longer than the people, most people in this field. And she's been helping a lot of people. And so as more cognitive has come out, or I remember DBT being a bad word in ERP treatment. And then we have John Hirschfeld who wrote his book and it's starting to do that. So I think there's so much that's out there now. We have so many more tools. And what I'm seeing, and I don't know if you all feel the same way, is like, I'm not seeing as much resistance anymore from clients. I'm not seeing, I see people that see your post, Jenna, and they feel inspired about this stuff now and they're anxious and they're excited. Versus I think the old way was like, holy crap, I have to go do this thing that's going to be hard and terrible, but it might give me some hope or might give me some change. And I do see a shift. I see a lot more people that are hearing about a lot more stuff out there and finding themselves a lot more inspired to get better.
Yeah. So, I want to talk a little bit about, I love, Brooke asked a question at 11:21 my time. She said, Liz, Chris, and Jenna, y'all are amazing. Thank you, Brooke. You're so sweet. We love you. And she said, if it's not too much, I could really use some motivation from you to complete my interceptive exposures today. I'm in a daily cycle of severe panic attacks right now, and I need to do the interceptives, but they're so scary and avoidance is so real. Would love, Jenna, to just hear your perspective of like, how do you push that? How do you encourage that? What does it look like?
So the first thing that comes to my mind, and like, this is, I think, just the clinician in me, when I am working with somebody or just like asking, like answering a question in this way, like my mind is like, okay, I put myself in that person's shoes. So like, I'm like in Brooke's shoes right now. I'm like, okay, I am really afraid of these sensations and I need to do these interoceptives. Okay. Like what would I need to be telling myself in this situation to get myself to do it? So, what I would probably, and I so often tell myself this when I have to do my own, like, pushing myself outside of my own comfort zone, is like, the hardest it's ever going to be is right now. Like the easiest it's ever going to be is right now. It is only ever going to get harder 5 minutes from now, and then 10 minutes from now, and then tomorrow. It's only going to get harder. It's hard. Like doing those interoceptives, yes, like it is uncomfortable. It is not a pleasant feeling. And it's the easiest that it's going to be right now. So like, what I would tell myself is like, okay, like if I want to give myself as much of a fighting chance as possible, instead of waiting for 5 minutes or for an hour or for 3 hours, like I might as well do it now, because this is the easiest it's going to be. The more that you avoid, the more that you give credibility to that. Right. So I think when we talk about the cycle of OCD, I think we really skip over, we tend to just say like, oh yeah, those compulsions reinforce the OCD cycle. But like, what does that mean? What that means is every single time that you give into avoidance or a compulsion or a ritual or a safety behavior, you literally are giving credibility to that misinterpretation. You're giving credibility to that idea that, oh my gosh, that's going to be terrible. I can't feel that way. I can't handle feeling that way. If I feel that way, I'm going to feel uncomfortable forever. All of those misinterpretations about why you are avoiding these interoceptives, every single time that you avoid it, you literally give your brain that message that, oh, good thing you didn't do that because you wouldn't have been able to tolerate it. Good thing you didn't do that because otherwise something really bad would have happened. And like, I don't know, to our point of like fighting against OCD, I've always been very competitive. Like I'm just a very competitive person. I'm an Enneagram 8 for anybody who knows anything about Enneagram. Like I am very competitive. Like I don't want that entity to win. Like, no, like if this is me against OCD, like absolutely not. Like I might be shaken on the inside, but I don't really care how I feel on the inside. Like I am going to go and do the dang thing because I refuse to do something that is going to make this entity stronger in me. So like as scary as it is, I'm going to bring my A game and I'm going to do the dang thing.
I also feel like, sorry, Chris, I feel like for me, before I had treatment, I used to think of rituals as being like this drug, almost like when you do rituals, you like get this high or you like feel this relief. And you guys, I remember the first time I actually did ERP. And what I mean by that is like, I actually leaned in, I like fully did it. I immersed myself and I got that freedom. That's when I was like, oh, this is the real high. Like this is right. Because not only did you actually get sustaining relief, right? You also felt so proud of yourself. Like it was such a resilience building like experience for me, that I think sometimes people don't understand that ERP should feel really good after you do it. And it should be sustaining freedom and be able to change your relationship. But like Jenna's saying, so many things we do that even lead up to our ERP, we're still sending that message that this is dangerous, this is scary, I can't do this, I'm not capable. And that's why we always say like, think less, do more, right? But like the more we start to just change that behavior and change that experience, we quit sending those messages to our brain that we don't realize we're sending so many times before and after ERP that's actually keeping us a little bit stuck in the process.
Yeah. I've just always been like on a mission to get as mentally strong as I can. And like, obviously we can't all be mentally strong and that can't be a compulsive thing either. But even in like my Instagram stuff, right? So as anyone gets bigger and especially in like on social media, right? Like every once in a while you'll get people who really don't like what you have to say and so on and so forth. And I used to take that so personally and take that so seriously. And it used to make me not want to do it anymore. But I remember telling myself one day, like, if I want to be here in like the advocacy world for the long haul and like as part of my business and stuff, right? Like part of being that sustainable person is to be able to handle that, right? Like I have to be able to handle someone not liking what I have to say or someone disagreeing with it. I have to be okay with that. And so every time now that that happens, I'm like, I guess this is all in the spirit of me getting a little bit stronger, right? This is all in the spirit of me getting a little bit stronger. Like you have to go through those things in order to get stronger. It is just the name of the game, right? It's just what you have to do. Even the other day, there was a new movie that came out and it was about like the end of the world and there was this family in a log cabin. I don't remember the title of it, but
yeah. It's I saw that movie. It's literally called like The Log Cabin. It's like Cabin in the Woods. That's
yes. It's like M. Night Shyamalan. And so I have a really big thing. My OCD is about like suffering. And of course, like with my son, like I was like, oh my gosh, that sounds like an absolutely miserable movie. Like that would be really challenging for me. And so I'm like, my first thought was, I guess I need to go and see this movie. I don't like for things to be in the way of my life. I just won't tolerate it. And so I guess it's what call it like just the personality that you develop after having doing this for so long, or like the tenaciousness of wanting your life back and really owning that freedom. Like if something scares me, even if I'm shaking on the inside, it's like, no, I know I need to go and do that. Like, I know I need to go and do that. Like, I refuse to let something kind of win my life over.
I was going to add real quick, Brooke, because I had panic attacks as well, is what two introspective exposures that helped me that didn't feel like introspective exposures was working out, because I hated getting my heart rate up and I hated sweating because that's what I felt during panic attacks. So I started to work out consistently. And then second of all, I had banned caffeine in my life and I started drinking green tea because the heart racing and stuff. So that really helped me get over that. So just want to throw those two things out there. The other thing, when I was in grad school, one of the things that they taught us is to find your client's strengths. And that's something that I do with all my clients. And I think that's what's important too. Just like you were saying, Jenna, and your question, Liz, is like, how do we get people motivated? And so that's why I don't feel like ERP is a one size fits all. So whenever someone's like, but I can't do that because the manual, and I'm like, like the manual is for when you first start out, but like as you get more seasoned, you get more flexibility. And so for every client, when they're sitting there, like I think about their greatness. I'm like, what are they going to be doing after treatment? Like, what is their life going to look like? Right now, they're on my couch, they're shaking, they're small, they're not wanting to be here, they're afraid. They've been doing their rituals for so long, but I know they have something great in them, and finding that strength and then really leaning in with that and teaching the client their own strength, because I want them to be their own therapist. I want them to leave the office and say, man, this is important. So a recent client comes to mind who, before OCD really hit, she was working in the caring field. She was really helping people lower income find housing. And so that need for her to help others was her strength. That I knew that was going to triumphant over OCD's messaging. And so like leaning into that was really helpful for her. And every time we'd go out and do an exposure, instead of thinking of the exposure, she thought of the bigger picture. Like, if I can push through this today, I'm taking, we had like a figurative like game board. And it was like, every time you go and you push through this, your game board figure is moving closer to going back and helping your people. And that was what drove her. So I think that's another thing to really help out, is like, what is everybody's strength? And let's lean into that.
I love it. I love it so much. We've got a couple questions I really want to get to. The first one that I love is from Chantel at 1119. She says, I tried ERP on my own for POCD, and I think I took the imaginal story too far. And now I'm feeling guilty that I may have triggered something else. Can I push past this and get back on track? So I see this all the time. I know you guys too, where sometimes it's on our own. Sometimes we have experiences with not great clinicians who, I shouldn't say that, that's not fair, but like with clinicians who they push patients to go too far or beyond what they are willing to do or what they morally feel good about. And so then their OCD starts to latch onto what they did for ERP, and they start to have guilt and shame. And so, yeah, great question, Chantel. How do we push through this, Jenna? What does that look like for a patient, and how do they get back on track?
A couple of things, right? Like I would tell Chantel, this is not your fault. I think this goes back to some of the issues that we have with ERP and what it is, especially when it comes to a taboo and very complex and nuanced theme like POCD. I think a lot of newer clinicians, especially those who like haven't been in the field for a long time, we jump right to scripts, and scripts can be great. Like I think scripts definitely have their time and place. In my experience, they're very like either hit or miss. And I have reasons why as to why I think that, but, I always, again, like back to my residential roots, if I gave anybody an imaginal or a script, I was always like, give me every reason why and every other thing you tried and why you had to go to the script instead. It was kind of like the scripts were like the last resort. Like we tried all these other things and we just couldn't get our foot in the door. And so we started with a script. I'm always like, what's going on in the real world? Like if you are doing rituals and you are avoiding things, you have real estate to do exposures like in vivo in real life. And I definitely assign imaginals. I definitely assign scripts. That's not to say that I hate them completely, but especially when it comes to POCD, we don't necessarily need you to go off into this really detailed story and push yourself over the edge like that. It could be as simple as like taking the route to work where you pass a school, or taking the route to work where you pass a playground, or making sure that you are giving your child a bath instead of your husband or your partner, right? And so especially when it comes to POCD, but arguably for a lot of other subtypes too, it's like I would always try to go to like in real life, like what are some real life things that we could do. And we don't need to push you outside that comfort zone. I would never have anybody do anything that's illegal or that I wouldn't myself do. But what are the things that other people in your life are doing that you have a hard time doing? Babysitting, hanging out with kids, being around kids, so on and so forth. So that's my first thought, is try to think about the things instead, like in your real life, in your actual life, that you could do. And then as far as like pushing past this or getting past this, it seems like you did an exposure, but the ritual prevention piece wasn't strong enough yet. That's another area where I think as clinicians, we rush too quickly into the exposure piece, but we don't build the muscle of the ritual prevention. So
which is more important than the exposure. Let's 100%. Make sure we all know that.
Yeah. In my opinion, the only purpose of an exposure is to practice response prevention. If you are doing an exposure and doing this challenging thing just to do the ritual, you are either, at best, you are just negating your hard work, which sucks. At worst, you're actually reinforcing that OCD because you've just done another ritual. So I would rather somebody do a smaller exposure, like a more baby, like leaping pad exposure with good ritual prevention, than do this crazy exposure while still doing rituals. So it seems like that's probably where this person got confused. And my final point is that it's not Chantel's fault, right? This is where like we just tend to go wrong as a field. And so being able to look on that difficulty with curiosity and not judgment, not, oh my gosh, I can never get better. Oh my gosh, like I failed. Oh my gosh, this must mean that I'm a pedophile. Looking back on those mishaps with curiosity versus judgment, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah. And I will say that like, while certain exposures, we might be able to candidly say like, we would not do that again, or like that it doesn't align with our values, there is still an opportunity afterwards to say, okay, like have curiosity, like, okay, I did that. I've learned, I wouldn't have really done that again. And let's still do some ERP about that, in the sense that like, you still need to, you can't just walk around feeling guilty forever about this exposure. You do have to be able to say, okay, like I took that too far. I wish I wouldn't have done that, or I learned my lesson or whatever. And that's okay. Like live and learn and move on, and like leaning into it versus still staying stuck in that one thing. So I see this happen a lot with contamination, where like providers will push contamination exposures that patients aren't really comfortable with. And then it's like, well, things are more contaminated. Now I'll never forgive myself. Like I caused this harm to people. I did these things. And it's like, okay, we might agree if some of the exposures were inappropriate that like, yeah, you don't have to do those. And we don't have to do that to get to your core fear. And we still need to do some exposure, but more importantly, I would say acceptance work around that exposure. Cause like it's in the past. Okay. You learn from it, give yourself grace, give yourself forgiveness, and move forward.
Right.
If we could throw up real quick, I wanted to throw up Betsy's comment at 9:31. Oh, perfect. At 12:31, Brennan, your time. What can therapists do for someone who went through the old way of ERP? Well, that's a good comment from Betsy as well. But yeah, thank you, Brennan. If what Jenna, Liz, and I are talking about today feels so much different than the treatment you're doing, the thing is, what I want to say is like ERP is not a bad thing. And if you've gone to ERP and you've done it the more manualized way, or it was a little bit more old school or archaic, it's not that ERP itself is bad. It's just what happened is a lot of people went through it because that was when we really focused on habituation. So the idea back then was we got to get our clients to really struggle and feel that anxiety and feel that distress, so they learn to kind of move past it and get over it, and that the anxiety goes down. And with Jonathan Abramowitz's work on inhibitory learning, the way that I think of treatment now is much different. I think the goal of treatment is to teach our clients something new. My client needed to know that she can engage at a zoo and she can go and pet dogs, and just like everybody else, she can be safe and not get sick. And so I didn't need her to be crying and screaming on the floor for her to learn that. She could be petting, not an alpaca, but llama, maybe she was petting, but she could pet a llama and learn like, this is fun, this is silly, I'm having a good time. And she got just as better as maybe if I would have been doing treatment 20 years ago, right? So we're not saying ERP is a bad thing. I don't want anyone to hear it, but just like anything in our field, it advances, it moves forward. And so my hope, and one of the missions that we've been trying to do, is as newer clinicians come in the field, we don't want them to jump away from ERP because it's so beneficial. We just want them to learn that there's a lot new ways of doing it. Michael Tuig's work, obviously, with ACT. I look at so many people's work that they've made ERP something that, candidly, I wish I would have gone through more likely now versus back then. But I'm hoping that people are hearing that it's not about abandoning ERP. It's just done now in a way that people are going through it and feeling a lot better as clinicians and people as they go through this process.
I also want to throw in, so I just want to tell people this, that I 100% received old school therapy, right? Like, did things that like I wouldn't do with clients now, right? So like I had fears, scrupulosity fears, and they had me doing stuff that like I would not do, like in the sense that we don't need to do that. We like took it a little bit far, that we could have gotten to the same things with more values-based exposures. However, and I talk a lot about this, it worked. So I also don't want us to feel like, oh, if I got treated the old way, then like that's wrong and I shouldn't have done that. And it's like, no, like if it worked for me, then it's okay. And as Jenna's saying, I actually don't use scripts a lot. That much anymore. But as Jenna said, there is a time and a place that scripts make a lot of sense. John Hirschfeld talked about this, Chris, in our combined, talk at IOCDF, where we were like, yeah, I might not sit on the floor and eat M&Ms off the floor for all my contamination patients, but for some patients, that's really important and makes a really big difference, right? I'll give an example. I have a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old. They eat food off the floor all day long. If every time they do, it throws me into a total loop, that exposure might be a huge values-based exposure for me. If I'm saying, hey, I want to be able to be present with my kids and not get thrown off for 2 hours if they eat something that fell on the floor, like where for someone else, there might be like no reason why it would make sense, right? And so again, I also don't want us to say like old ERP or clinicians who've been around for a long time are doing it wrong. No, we evolve and we grow. And back then, the treatment I did, it worked and it worked really well, but it's evolved. It's become better. It doesn't mean all of it was terrible, or it doesn't mean, right? And so I want us to be thoughtful about that too, is just that with anything in life, right? I hope that we evolve and we grow. When I first had my daughter 2 years ago, I remember my mom was like, y'all have all these new rules. We didn't put you on your back to sleep. We didn't do this. We didn't do that. And like, all of y'all are just fine. So like, what does that mean? And I was like, Mom, like, relax. Like, it's not a right or wrong. I was like, but there's a lot that's been learned, right? So like, we know a lot more about SIDS now, and it is recommended that you put your kids on the back, and here's why. And like, that doesn't mean like the way you raised me was wrong. But what it means is like, hey, we've learned and we've grown, and like there's new advice and new recommendations that you follow. And I want us to think about that for ERP. Like, ERP doesn't have to be this way it was presented and done 15 years ago without any flexibility. Like, if anything, everything we're teaching you is flexibility. It should evolve. It should be flexible. It should shift. And that's a part of the process.
Go on, Jenna.
I was going to say, I think like what I'm hearing, the word that comes to my mind is willingness, right? Like, you did a certain type of exposure, Liz, that was very traditional and kind of like a long time ago. And maybe today people are doing similar exposures, but they're different and they might have evolved and they're better. But in either scenario, you're growing, hopefully, willingness, right? Like if you're doing it with the right intentions, it's fostering willingness. And that's what it all comes down to. I think they've even done a research study that showed that like the one factor that is most heavily correlated or predictive of long-term recovery in OCD is willingness / psychological flexibility, which I think is so telling, right? Like, I think that's why you can do those old school hardcore exposures, and that might not be what you've done today, but it still worked, versus somebody can do something today. And it's like you're building and fostering and nurturing willingness. Does anybody know, this is like the one analogy that I really wanted to squeeze in here. Does anybody remember or watch Vanderpump Rules? Let me know in the chat if you, okay.
A lot of our folks are going to say yes.
So if you don't know Vanderpump Rules, there was this old, and you've probably seen the meme, but there was this guy named James, and he brought his girlfriend out to dinner. And a lot of the girls in Vanderpump Rules, they didn't like this girlfriend. And so they were like teasing her. And at this dinner, they were eating her pasta. And this girlfriend, she went to the bathroom. They were all like sneaking and eating her pasta. And James got really offended by that. Like, oh my gosh, like, why can't you just like accept my girlfriend? You're being so mean to her. I accept your people. Why can't you accept my girlfriend? And all of the girls were like, I just had a bite of her pasta. It's not that big of a deal. And the meme that went viral was like, it's not about the pasta. It's not about the pasta. Like, I don't care that you had a bite of her pasta. It's about the fact that you are so disrespectful to her and to me, and like not accepting me. And I was known for literally printing that meme out and like putting it all over my residence and all over my clients' doors, because I would tell them that all the time. Like I would make them watch that scene. It's not about the M&Ms on the floor. It's not about you shaking this person's hand. It's not about you making that phone call. It's not about me driving on the highway and not checking my son. It's about getting your life back. It's about not listening to OCD. It's so much bigger than that. And so I think a lot of times, especially when we're in the zone and in those exposures, we get so enveloped by content and we get so emotionally invested in the story that OCD is telling us. We get into the M&M on the floor, or we get into this, or we get into that. And it's like, it's not about that. Like, it's not about that. It's not about the peripheral, superficial thing that's happening. It's about getting your life back. And so it's not about the pasta. It's the best meme ever. And it like is totally applicable here.
I literally like want to heart, and I hate this thing can't let us heart. We're always like, there's things that I'm like, Britt, like we need that. We need to resave that, because I love this so much. Because here's the thing. Sometimes exposures themselves are about the content, right? Because people get confused of like, oh, so I shouldn't even do ERP about my content. It's like, well, yes, of course. Like that's how we're learning, right? We're using your current triggers, that content to develop with you what you need to be doing, right? Like, yes, for Jenna, fears around her son, like the content, like that fear allowed her to create that exposure. But what Jenna's saying is that, and then I want everyone to hear this, you guys, is that it's about the relationship with anxiety and OCD that we're shifting across the board. So yes, right now, when Jenna's driving down, when you were driving down the road for that exposure, it was about that specific fear. But that's actually not what treatment's about. Treatment wouldn't be successful if we just got rid of that one fear, because we all know the way OCD works, this game of whack-a-mole, the next one pops up, the next one pops up, and we're constantly just, hitting fear. Where instead it's about the process, it's about the principle. And so it's so interesting because I'm redoing this feedback form that we ask patients before and after. And 5-10 years ago, people asked, what are your SUDs? What are your SUDs now? And we don't ask that here anymore. Instead, we say, what are you learning? Yeah. What did you learn? Right? Because I don't care if you're at a 10 out of 10 anxiety level. Like, yes, of course I want to support you, but like, that's not what matters. It's what did you learn? What muscle are you flexing? Has your psychological flexibility gotten stronger? Has it increased? Right? And I love that so much. I'm going to steal that meme and go put it on our patient stores here and say, love Jenna,
I think sometimes like we forget, we get so in that OCD bubble and we are so like just
tunnel vision,
tunnel vision. And we listen to everything that it says and we forget like, oh yeah, I can totally see how it's not about the pasta. Yeah. Lala, like you need to be more respectful, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, but we would never like, once we can make that connection, like, oh my gosh, OCD does that too. It's like, okay, I get it.
So, I think that's the turning point in treatment, when people can be like, oh, I see this. I saw my mom do this yesterday with my little, my little brother when he was crying, where she just gave in and reinforced the behavior. And you're like, that's the moment, right? Because that's when it's like, oh, I see this everywhere, like all the time. Chris, sorry, I know I keep hitting you.
No, it's all good. I was going to say, Brendan always clips stuff, so you better clip the pasta meme. But to add to the pasta meme is like, one thing I always tell my clients is like, go bigger, go bigger, go bigger. So like, Jenna, if you were my client and you were talking to me and you're like, look, Chris, I'm consistently pulling over to check to make sure my son is there. Like I'm really not like feeling comfortable. I can see in my rear view that he's there, but I have to like be sure, right? Like one of the things that I talk to clients about is like, the goal of treatment is not the exposure there to try to go another exit before pulling over and eventually going a whole trip before pulling over is a means to a bigger end. So I tell people, go bigger. Like, what am I trying to teach Jenna in this moment? What I'm trying to teach Jenna is that OCD has conned you into not trusting yourself. I always tell people that OCD reminds me of like a political enemy, and they're constantly like bashing you and saying these horrible things about you. And OCD is like putting ads out like, Jenna drives around with her kid at the, on the floor at home and dirty and messy, and she's driving her luxury car around the town and the kid's not even in the back seat. Like OCD has now plastered that, and we start to believe it over time. And so the goal of treatment, the exposure is a mean to an end. The bigger and the go bigger is like, I'm a mom who cares about my son. There's no way in hell I'm ever going to get in my car and my son's not going to be there. It's this uncomfortable feeling about the doubt. So if I pull over and check the back seat, I am not becoming a better mom. I'm becoming a better slave to the OCD. And if my goal in treatment is to learn how to get rid of the OCD, if I pull over, I am giving OCD a +1 and a +1, and it's growing. If I don't pull over, I'm saying, I trust myself to be able to put my kid in the car. I trust what I see right now. And I trust that eventually, no matter what OCD says to me, I learn that I don't have to listen. Last really quick thing I always tell my clients, especially if they're college students, I was like, let's look at the source. You cannot quote a horrible website or on your term paper in class. OCD is like a really bad website. It's some foreign website that's not even in good English, that doesn't have a good source. So stop footnoting OCD. Why do you think that you didn't put your kid in the car? Because OCD told you? OCD is the worst person to get information from. Stop believing OCD and believe yourself. And that's what I think that go bigger means. And by the end of treatment, I want clients to be able to say, I don't care if I get 7 more subtypes. It doesn't matter anymore because I've learned how to believe in myself and I've learned how to move forward. And like you said, Liz, change my relationship with the OCD.
Yeah, and what I want to add in too that we have touched on before is the goal for Jenna in that scenario would not be that she'd be okay with leaving her kid.
Yeah,
right.
because you never will be okay with that.
Important because so many people think, oh, so like treatment means like you want me to just be okay. And it's like, no. Treatment means we want you to be able to have the value of being a mom, putting your kid in the car, getting and taking your child somewhere, but not stuck the whole time driving in your head and ruminating, right? So it's really important to touch on.
And it's like, I'm not sitting there like, oh yeah, 50-50. I might have left him in the car, maybe I didn't. I might have left him in the car, maybe I didn't. 50-50. Like, it's like, I am not even going there. Like, I'm letting all of those questions come up because I can't help them but to come up. I'm just not going to answer those questions, right? It's like, I don't know if it's 50-50. I don't know if it's 99 to 1. I don't know. And I don't care because I'm moving forward. I'm not going backwards and I'm not going to answer OCD's questions. So it's not this 50-50 type of thing.
No, and actually, guys, this is one of my favorite ERP analogies, and I had like 10 other things I wanted us to get to, so we're going to have you back on if you're willing, and we have so many questions, and this has been so great. But I talk a lot about, I use ERP as this like trash can analogy sometimes, where I want people to imagine if someone has OCD fears around throwing something away, and like, what if I accidentally threw something valuable away? And so their typical rituals are to check the trash and double check and getting stuck. We can all agree that an exposure for them is to throw stuff in the trash. The response prevention is to not check the trash, right? You bag it up. But if you bag that trash bag up and you walk to your garage and you put it there, and this happens all the time, every day, right? And I hear patients say things like, well, I did the ERP, but the thought still kept popping up and I still kept ruminating about it and I still kept thinking about it. I'm like, well, what happened in that scenario? They're like, well, I kept thinking, well, I can go check it if I want. I could go back and see, like, it's there. And like, I saved it there just in case it got bad enough I would need it. That is torture. Yeah. That is not ERP. And then I asked them, well, what happens when you walk that trash bag to the curb? And every patient says the same thing. While it's harder in that moment, when it gets hauled off, I get freedom because I know that at the end of the day, like I live in Houston, you're not going to go to the landfill and find your trash, even if you needed to. So even if like, there's nothing I can do anyways, but I've done that exposure all the way, right? To where I'm not going to keep ruminating about it later because there's nothing we can do anyways. And I want us to think about that when we think about ERP. The goal with when you put your child in your car seat is not, okay, now I'm just going to have to lean into the whole car ride that they may or may not be in the seat, because that actually keeps the fear there. And people think that's what ERP and uncertainty is, where actually, no, it's about, I did this, I put the child in, I'm getting in the car, and the exposure is, I'm moving on, right? I can't go back. I'm not keeping it in the garage. I'm not keeping it in my headspace or as a possibility where I can keep attending to it. Like, no, we are letting it go. We are recognizing it and moving on. And it's just, that's what ERP should do for you. ERP should allow you to have freedom, right? And it should feel good in the sense that it really gets you more clarity as you do it. It should not keep you stuck. I always tell my patients, if you're getting more stuck, if it's not working, we're doing something wrong. We're holding on somewhere, there's something happening. So next time we have you on, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about when you are holding on to ERP, you're not leading in, but then I really want to cover some of the new stuff you've been talking about. So roadblocks in treatment and roadblocks in recovery in particular. I love this topic. And I know you've been talking a little bit about just kind of what that might look like and what comes up. And I think this is so important because we have a lot of individuals where they've done ERP, they kind of know how to do it, but then in the recovery process, sometimes we get stuck. And I was there for a lot of us, right? We were there at different times and we've had to figure that out and work through that. And gosh, Jenna, like your personal, professional insight, experience, the language you use, you are truly amazing. This has been so great.
Well, like
Jenna,
I said,
where can they go and find you? Where can they go?
Where can you find me? So I live mostly on Instagram. I'm just at jenna.overbaugh.
I thought you were about to tell them your address. You're like,
I was like, don't do that. I was like, no, don't stop.
Come on over, Wisconsin. It's nice. Come on over. We're very friendly. We'll offer you a drink and some cheese curds. It's totally fine. But yeah, on Instagram, jenna.overbaugh. DM me. I love chatting with you guys. It's super, super fun. I love getting people excited about this stuff. That's like my mission. So
well, you are amazing, and I think the thing, like I said, we use your stuff here, so you can charge us some copyright fees if you want. But
that's like absolutely absolutely mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, so we created, we love it.
Well,
so we
call it OCD, call it doubt, call it imposter syndrome, but I'm like, no way. No way.
I'm serious. We love it. And we have this, what we call standard BP when patients first start, where we give them like, while you're building up your personal treatment plan, here's things we want you to do. And it is so much of your content. What I love so much, you guys, about Jenna's content is it's so digestible for anyone. And it's so hard for us to kind of give clinical information that's easily digestible, and like you do that perfectly. So thank you. Today has been amazing. We are so grateful for you and your time. I know everyone loved it. We keep hearing that and seeing that. So we will have you back on as long as you're willing.
Amazing. I would love to. Thank you guys so much. Bye guys.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, Jenna, thank you so much for coming, Jenna. We appreciate it. We're going to plan a part 2. So if you enjoyed this with Jenna, we're going to get our schedules together and have a part 2. And then next week, we'll be back same time. We're going to have John Hirschfield, who's a friend of all of ours, back on the live. There was a question from Jessica about DBT. So he wrote a book on DBT and OCD. So come to that. The other thing is, if you came late or you think somebody would find Jenna's advice really helpful, please make sure to send them this link. They can watch it back. And check Jenna out on Instagram. She has a lot of really good resources. And like, I'm a worksheet person, so I've seen that she's posted some stuff. So go to her site. So thank you everyone for hanging out with us today. Thanks, ladies. It's so good seeing you.